The 1970s has been deemed by some as perhaps the strongest decade in film of the modern era. The collapse of the general studio system called for lowly creators to produce low-budgeted material at an expedited rate unforeseen by past generations. What resulted was an array of films that really emphasized the cultural zeitgeist of 1970s America. The age of exploitation cinema was a pervasive escape from the glossy, procedural studio pictures of days past. These kinds of films allowed audiences to see the underbelly of society as a snapshot of what civil unrest and angst was so prevalent during the Vietnam years. Interestingly enough, a number of films in this vein have lived on to see their artistic merits be gradually praised more and more as time goes on. Perhaps one of the prime examples of such a film to emerge from this era, and particularly to horror films, is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Texas Chainsaw, if you were judging the book by the cover, looked to be a film that went for shock value. From the strikingly unapologetic title, what this film appeared to offer was another addition to the gory, bloody, obscenity-laden library of exploitation films of the times. But what appeared to be offered was simply a guise for something much more substantive and encapsulating. While stocked with overtly bizarre characters and harrowing sequences of terror, the film provides a very real look into a harsh transitional period in American history. Looking at the script, there's no confusion as to what the film actually is. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a film about lost Americans, caught in the abyss of where the country was hit hardest. Additionally, the aesthetic approach, while arguably unintentional, paints a vivid portrait of disenfranchised Americans obscured by outsourcing and economic globalism. From the script to the production and the final product itself, it's time to dissect Texas Chainsaw from top to bottom to emphasize its artistic and historical relevance. The yearnings of 1970s America is something mentioned on this channel before. Walloped by the losses of the Vietnam War, the country was civilly anxious since the end of the 60s. So began an era of escapism, be it through pioneering art or through psychedelics and hallucinogenics. Throughout the arts, the discontent of American youth was vibrant and vivid, whether it was through culturally subversive rock and roll music, a borderline hedonistic foray into sex and drugs, or through the visual medium of film and photography. A generation of Americans was mobilized. Often, the arts took a bold and unconventional route from the traditional norms. The era served as an exploratory juncture into individuality and personal freedom. Artists tended to dabble into downright bizarre or risque forms of art, many of them abstract or experimental. On the other hand, some films went the exploitative route. These, in essence, were concept films that sought profits from a more one-dimensional appeal to the senses. Sex, violence, and drugs ran rampant through these kinds of films, usually one being the central focus. A prime example of such a motion picture would be Wes Craven's debut film, The Last House on the Left. Without going too much into detail, the 1972 picture captures the rebellious exuberance and spirit of adolescence in the early 1970s. The film goes down the exploitative route by barraging the viewer with horrifying sexual violence and, later on, bloody vengeance. While that particular film has its flaws, it's a strong example of what kind of culturally subversive films were unique of the times. It's debatable that even the harshest independent films of today don't go as far as some creations of the new wave. Filmmakers in a massively lucrative market were able to explore a range of ideas, no matter their extremity or lack of kosher. Independent studios were thriving, shelling out micro-budgets for the sake of making a quick buck. Media wasn't massively controlled by a handful of companies like it is today, and furthermore, the gatekeepers of entertainment had fallen, making distribution more feasible and consumer-driven than ever before. This seemed to make filmmaking more personal and idiosyncratic. Filmmakers at large were able to have their voices be heard, and allowed for audiences to explore crevices of society which had never before been seen or revealed. On a domestic note, the 1970s was infamous for its dissolution of American manufacturing. The two oil crises in the early and late 1970s transformed consumer tastes in automobiles toward more fuel-efficient foreign models and forced a technical retooling of the industrial machinery and labor processes. Ever seeking less expensive labor, American firms relocated many elements of automobile manufacturing beyond American borders. The vacant factories and homes of the deindustrialized Rust Belt became domestic symbols of the new globalized auto-industrial age, per reports from the University of Michigan. This effect seemed to transcend across American manufacturing, but most notably in rural communities. These sects of America were reliant on industry as a bedrock of their sustainability. When that fell from beneath them, the descent into chaos was all but inevitable. Within the vast independent circuit was a young Texas filmmaker, one who had spent most of the late 60s as a documentarian and college professor. We know that filmmaker to have been Tobe Hooper. Hooper's earlier work consisted of material that touched on some of the defining qualities of independent New Wave cinema. His 1964 film The Heisters was a short comedy that played more like a Warner Brothers bit from the 50s, but Eggshells was a much more bizarre avant-garde feature that captured the essence of rebellion into psychedelics and anti-establishment energy. TCM looks to be the twisted offspring of these two previous films, and what Hooper incorporated into what became TCM was not only the sharpened qualities from his previous films, but also a dismal look into his own locale. With that said, we should really look into the film itself, and that starts with the foreboding intro. The opening scrolling titles with the ominous narration is a prelude to a neo-reality like many descendants of films years later. We're then introduced to the cinematography of Daniel Pearl with a masterful opening shot. More on that later. It's very reminiscent of the face-off that Father Merrin has with the demon Pazuzu statue at the beginning of The Exorcist. The opening title sequence picks up with these vague but hellish visuals. They're simplistic, yet the avant-garde soundtrack of New Wave cinema really kicks in that kind of cerebral feeling. And then noticeably a newscast comes over the title sequence, which defines all the harrowing events that have been happening in the local areas of grave robbers and mutilations and whatnot. And that's Hooper's own commentary on the news media's obsession with bleak headlines from the Times, with all the bleak Vietnam reporting and everything that was going through the news cycle of the Times. Hooper felt it was important to capture the essence of what this bottom-feeding nature of the press was. Here, the viewer is presented with what feels like a documentary that we're not supposed to see, which we'll also later dissect. But let us first sink into the landscape in which we experience this far-out nightmare. The film opens in the catacombs of an abysmal Texas, not unlike much of Middle America suffering through the economic globalization of the times. Forget about the rotting, scolding corpses at first glance. The setting itself is harrowing. With nothing but an array of decrepit former businesses, we're immediately put into a hopeless environment. Not only are we in the sizzling pit of Texas, the entire country has forgotten about us. We've been left to hitchhike on a road of economic disparity. The harsh Texas sun casts a morose, ominous hue on the veneer of the film, and it captures the vast side of Texas rarely boasted in mainstream films. Perhaps the film is trying to show us the side of America we would turn away from, pretending it doesn't exist, just as the government had done to these very areas. It's left to decay and chaos, and would be much less effective if not for the achievements of Daniel Pearl's cinematography. Perhaps the central hallmark of this film is the cinematography, achieved by Daniel Pearl, who even shot the remake in 2003, and this was shot on 16mm film, the look that really defined independent cinema for a generation. Mr. Lobo of Cinema Insomnia has described the look of the 16mm print as murky, and that holds true. Though it's shot by Pearl, it really draws on Hooper's past as a documentary filmmaker. There's a series of wide, stationary shots that allow the viewer to be immersed in the environment and the interactions of the characters, and it makes the setting harsher and emphasizes the vastness of this hopeless landscape. And partnered with the faux true story guise, this feels more real. Like a lost documentary we shouldn't be watching, it attributes a dirty, visceral feeling to the viewer experience. You can feel the characters' feelings, smell those environments and all through the camera work, which also taps into the psychedelic tendencies of early 1970s cinema. The macro shots very close up on the eye, the repeated zooms, the fast cuts, all of that kind of stuff taps in with the aesthetic qualities of that generation. Separately speaking though, the film is just shot gloriously. Sure, in a documentary style, yet the composition is masterfully crafted in this film. Hooper and Pearl use their talents to create a visceral aesthetic that still hasn't been effectively emulated. In all the years since, the many sequels, rip-offs, and rehashes of this style never get the cinematography right. Too many of the shots look polished and very brushed up and very pretty, not capturing that raw feel that the original film exudes with its 16mm print and documentary style. And going hand in hand with the cinematography and the setting is the overall design of the film. Everything is death. There's dead animals, cooked animals, tombs, you name it. Images of death everywhere in this movie. The landscape, the businesses, they all look like they were nuked, and it paints a picture of the conditions of Midwestern America of the times. Now with that, the characters serve as vehicles for us to experience that. Now, even most fans of this film will likely admit the characters aren't very complex. Most of the time they're yelling or screaming or groveling about something, it seems, with Franklin just being a bumbling klutz the entirety of his screen time. These characters mostly seem just like props for these psychopaths to horrify, but there's interesting material in the script that illustrates them perfectly and quickly in the first few pages.
This means Saturn's a bad influence. It's just particularly a bad influence now because it's in retrograde.
Hey man, you believe all that stuff your old lady's hawking me?
It can't help but seem intentional on the part of Hooper in making the protagonists pretty thinly written. They are the victims of the times, in a sense, roaming through a depleted America for their escape from reality. This doesn't make them all that unrealistic. Now, in terms of casting, Hooper said that he simply cast local actors with his low-budget means, and a couple that he already had known. This grounds the film even deeper in its neorealism. Franklin may be overly silly, but I suppose not completely unbelievable. These characters are generally 1970s normies that really serve as surrogates for the viewers to experience the film. Probably with the exception of Franklin.
Sorry!
But the real treat we get for characters are the Sawyers. Again, it would be slightly disingenuous to pretend the Sawyers are the most layered characters in all of film history. It's not like they have the depth of the characters from, say, Breaking Bad. They do, however, represent a much deeper and more poignant meaning than what their face value implies. Looking at the characters in this singular vacuum, however, provides for a disturbing look into the desperate American psyche during the downfall of industry. At face value, some may just see these psychos as stock rednecks, and in some aspect, maybe they're right. Exploitation films of the time generally didn't boast nuanced characters, but rather archetypes that could be entertaining enough on screen for the sake of a buck. Here, that same quality is somewhat present. The hitchhiker, whose name is Nubbins, greets us just a few moments into the film. He exudes those traits of wackiness and peculiarity that many would come to expect from an exploitation-style picture. His warped facial expressions, thick dialect, and violent body language is all customary of such a film. Luckily, Nubbins' personality is countered by that of the other Sawyers. Drayton Sawyer, better known as the proprietor, might be the best example of what the film really illustrates. He's the ringleader, obviously having been the frontman of the defunct local businesses. Where globalization and automation have failed him and his family, he's made some brash adjustments. An interesting thesis published by Regis University asserts that the Sawyers have changed their currency from money to flesh. This was captured with the shot inside the gas station in which Marilyn sees the meat cooking under the hellish red light. In the face of famine, Drayton has led his family to achieve survival by the direst of means. While Drayton is the brains of the operation, Leatherface is the bronze and the central figure everybody remembers. Over the years, Leatherface has become more of a cliché as the Chainsaw film series has really gone down its path. In context of the original, he's much more interesting. That interesting quality comes from his mysteriousness. As with Michael Myers, the more he was explored, the less interesting he became. The mystification stems from whatever unexplored turmoil drove him there. Unlike Michael Myers, you can actually see some kind of logical trajectory that made Leatherface into what he is. He is undoubtedly human, first of all, mentally impaired as well. It's hard to imagine he was born stitching flesh together or dancing around with his trusty saw at a young age, but his psychological impairment and collapse may very well be in synchronization with the economic recession of the 1970s. This represents the collapse of order in American economic stability. Sure, a brash and extreme characterization, but undoubtedly by design. Disenfranchised America was left to baste out in the desert, and this kind of reaction is sure extreme, but a vivid response to what many people might have been feeling at the time. And with that, we come to our conclusion of the film. It's made clear that things are bleak in many corners of the country, with only suggestions of Vietnam War anxiety. This much more focuses on the internal depreciation of economic independence, with the flyover states' perishing economies due to international dealings. American-made goods, machinery, and even farming were densely affected by the changes of the 1970s. And from a visual standpoint, this really showed the American fatigue that was visible at the time. The film does capture a bit of the youthful spirit of the times, with the adolescents feeling lost in their world, exploring means of enjoyment. And to the film's credit, this really doesn't dig too deep into the exploration with sex and drugs. It's a slight contrast from Halloween in terms of the character outlooks. The Sawyers are the stranded bystanders of the times. Having the rug yanked out from underneath them, they turn to manic means of survival. You can almost see a backstory that their better days were behind them, and I'm not talking about any of the ones that were in the prequel films. On top of that, the film's technical qualities prove it true as well. It's wonderfully shot and still captures that psychedelic, irreverent feel of the contemporary cinema. Its mesmerizing visuals also enhance the film's message, that being that evil isn't always some fantastical, otherworldly force. Evil is sometimes as human as any one of us. The film establishes that the Sawyers are definite psychopaths, but it's no help that the Sawyers were also victims of the times. And like the Joker once said, madness is like gravity. All you need is a little push.